Step away from the entrance. You're not authorized to be here. The words didn't echo. They sliced, clean and certain, cutting through the polished glass lobby like they had been practiced, like they had been used before, like they belonged here more than he did. Malcolm Hayes didn't move. He stood just outside the revolving doors of the building, hands tucked into the pockets of a worn charcoal jacket, posture relaxed, eyes steady, taking in everything without reacting to anything. The late morning sun bounced off the steel frame above him, casting sharp reflections across the sidewalk, catching the attention of passers-by who slowed just enough to notice something unfolding, something slightly off, something they couldn't yet name. The guard stood firm, one hand resting against the door handle as if guarding something valuable, his expression tight with authority that felt larger than his role. "I said wait outside," he added, louder this time, making sure the people walking past could hear, making sure the moment had witnesses. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, not in confusion, not in challenge, but in quiet observation, like someone watching a scene he had seen before, just with different faces. Inside, the lobby hummed with low conversation, heels clicking against marble floors, the soft hum of elevators opening and closing, everything operating exactly as it should, everything controlled, ordered, curated. And yet right here, at the threshold, there was a fracture. A subtle one, but real. Malcolm's gaze drifted briefly to the name etched in brushed metal beside the entrance, a name that carried weight, history, ownership. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. Behind the guard, a receptionist glanced up, her eyes flicking between the man outside and the uniform blocking him, curiosity tightening her expression before she quickly looked back down at her screen, choosing silence over involvement. It was a familiar rhythm. Malcolm shifted his weight slightly, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just existing in the space they were trying to deny him. A second guard approached from inside, slower, more deliberate, his eyes scanning Malcolm from head to toe, taking in the plain sneakers, the simple shirt, the absence of anything that signaled wealth, status, permission. "Deliveries go around back," the second guard said, his tone less sharp but no less dismissive, like he was offering help while reinforcing a boundary. Malcolm's lips pressed together for a brief moment, not quite a smile, not quite a reaction, just acknowledgement. "I'm not here for a delivery," he said, his voice calm, even, almost quiet compared to the volume that had been directed at him. The first guard scoffed lightly, a short breath of disbelief. "Then you're definitely in the wrong place." The words hung there, heavier than they sounded, heavier than the moment required, carrying something deeper beneath them. Malcolm didn't argue. He didn't explain. He simply looked past them, into the lobby, as if measuring distance, not in feet, but in decisions. A man in a tailored suit slowed his stride as he approached the entrance, pausing just enough to take in the scene before slipping past the guards without question, the door opening smoothly for him, welcoming him in. The contrast was immediate, unspoken, undeniable. Malcolm noticed. Of course he did. But his expression didn't change. It rarely did. A young woman standing near the entrance inside the building shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag as she watched, her eyes flicking between Malcolm and the guards, as if waiting for something to correct itself, as if expecting someone to step in and reset the moment. No one did. The first guard adjusted his stance, stepping slightly closer to Malcolm, narrowing the space even more. "You can wait out here if you need someone," he said, this time quieter, but somehow more final, like a decision had already been made on Malcolm's behalf. Malcolm exhaled slowly, his breath steady, controlled, not frustrated, not rushed. He had been here before. Not this exact place, not this exact building, but this moment, this tone, this assumption. It wasn't new. It never was. His eyes lowered for just a second, not in defeat, but in thought, in calculation, like he was letting the moment stretch just long enough for everyone involved to fully commit to it. Inside, the receptionist glanced up again, this time holding her gaze a fraction longer, her brows pulling together slightly, as if something didn't sit right. But still, she said nothing. Silence had its own gravity. A manager emerged from deeper within the lobby, his stride confident, his expression already set before he even reached the door. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need context. He had already decided what this was. "What's the issue here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer he wanted. The first guard gestured toward Malcolm with a subtle tilt of his head. Says he's not a delivery, he replied. The manager's eyes moved over Malcolm, quick, assessing, dismissive. Then he shouldn't be here, he said plainly, his voice carrying just enough to reach the nearby ears that were now pretending not to listen. Malcolm looked at him, directly this time, meeting his gaze without hesitation, without aggression, just presence. I have business inside, Malcolm said, his voice still calm, still controlled, still measured in a way that contrasted sharply with the certainty being projected at him. The manager let out a small, humorless laugh. Business? He repeated, the words sounding foreign in his mouth when attached to Malcolm. People with business don't stand out here arguing with security. The sentence landed with a finality that felt rehearsed, like a line delivered too many times to count. Malcolm didn't respond immediately. He let the words sit in the air, let them settle, let them become part of the record being built in real time. A man exiting the building slowed as he passed, glancing at Malcolm, then at the manager, then back again, his expression shifting from curiosity to quiet discomfort before he continued walking. The moment was growing, expanding. Malcolm could feel it, the way tension does when it's just beginning to peak, when it hasn't yet broken but is undeniably building. He reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, not in a threatening way, not in a rushed way, just enough to draw attention without alarming anyone. The guards tensed slightly, their posture shifting, their eyes narrowing just a fraction more. Malcolm pulled out his phone, holding it loosely in his hand, not raising it, not using it, just holding it as if it were part of the moment, part of the equation. The manager watched him closely now, his earlier confidence edged with something else, something less certain. If you're waiting for someone, you can do it out here, he said again, doubling down, reinforcing the line that had already been drawn. Malcolm glanced down at his phone briefly, then back up, his expression unchanged. That's exactly what I'm doing, he said quietly. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that hadn't been there before, a shift so subtle it was almost invisible, but real nonetheless. The young woman inside the lobby took a small step closer to the glass, her curiosity overcoming her hesitation, her eyes now fixed on Malcolm, on the way he wasn't reacting the way people usually did in situations like this, on the way he seemed almost patient. The manager crossed his arms, settling into his stance, convinced he had control, convinced the moment would resolve the way it always did. Malcolm stood there, unmoving, unbothered, letting the seconds pass, letting the scene fully form, letting every word that had been spoken settle into place. Then, almost as an afterthought, almost casually, he unlocked his phone screen, his thumb moving once, precise, intentional, before he looked back up at the manager, his voice low, steady, and impossible to misread. Good, he said, just loud enough for everyone near the entrance to hear. Let's keep it exactly like this. The air did not move, but something inside it shifted as if the moment itself had taken a breath and decided to stay longer than expected. Malcolm Hayes stood exactly where they had told him not to be, not inside, not welcome, not acknowledged, and yet entirely present. The glass doors reflected him back in fragments, a silhouette that did not match their assumptions, and that alone made the tension sharper. The manager adjusted his jacket as if resetting authority on his shoulders, glancing briefly toward the receptionist who now pretended to be absorbed in her screen, fingers moving, but eyes flicking up in intervals too precise to be accidental. You are holding up the entrance. The manager said, his tone tighter, now, less casual, more performative, like he needed the statement to sound official. Malcolm did not respond immediately. He let the words settle the way one lets dust fall after something has been disturbed. Then, he shifted his gaze slightly to the side, not away, not down, just enough to take in the people beginning to slow near the curb. A man with a coffee paused mid-sip. A woman scrolling her phone stopped scrolling, without realizing it. Moments like this pulled attention, without permission. Am I? Malcolm said quietly, not as a challenge, but as a mirror held up to the situation. The manager frowned, the question landing in a place he did not expect, because it did not escalate, it did not defend, it simply existed, and that made it harder to control. You were told where to wait, the first guard added, stepping half a foot closer, tightening the invisible line they had drawn around Malcolm's presence. And I am waiting. Malcolm replied, his voice, even measured, almost patient, the kind of tone that made people second-guess their own urgency. Inside the building, a security camera above the entrance angled slightly, its lens catching the entire scene, without judgment, without bias, just recording. Malcolm noticed it not with a glance, but with awareness, the way someone who understood systems noticed the parts others ignored. The young woman inside took another step closer, now standing just behind the glass, her reflection overlapping with Malcolm's, creating a brief illusion that they shared the same space, even though the door between them remained closed. "Sir, if you do not have an appointment, you cannot just stand here expecting access." The manager said. The word access stretched thin, like it carried more weight than it should. Malcolm's lips curved slightly, not into a smile, but into recognition of the language of exclusion, polished, refined, delivered as procedure instead of prejudice. "Who said I did not have one?" Malcolm asked softly, the question landing without force, but with precision. The manager hesitated for a fraction of a second, just enough for the pause to be noticed, just enough for control to flicker. "Then who are you here to see?" he asked, quickly recovering, trying to redirect, trying to reframe. Malcolm's thumb moved once across his phone screen, subtle, deliberate. Then he looked back up. "The person responsible," he said, and the answer was technically true in more ways than one. The guards exchanged a brief glance, not long enough to signal doubt, but long enough to acknowledge uncertainty. The manager scoffed, lightly stepping closer, now his shoes crossing the threshold between inside and outside, as if proximity alone would reassert dominance. "Everyone here is responsible for something that does not make you welcome," he said. Malcolm held his gaze steady, not challenging, not retreating, just present, the kind of presence that made people aware of themselves in ways they did not like. The man with the coffee lowered his cup completely, now his attention fully captured. A delivery truck rolled past slowly, the driver glancing over curiously, before continuing on the street. Noise faded into the background, replaced by the quiet tension gathering at the entrance. Malcolm's phone buzzed once, a soft vibration against his palm. He did not look at it immediately. Instead, he let the moment stretch just a second longer. Then he glanced down briefly, reading a single line, before locking the screen again. The shift was almost invisible, but real. His posture did not change, his expression did not harden, but something beneath both settled into place, like a decision had been confirmed. "You can either step aside, or we can have someone escort you further from the entrance," the second guard said, his tone still controlled, but now edged with something firmer, not aggression, but insistence. Malcolm turned his head slightly toward him, acknowledging the statement without reacting to its implication. "That will not be necessary," Malcolm said calmly. The manager exhaled sharply, as if patience had expired. "Then stop wasting time," he said louder, now the volume drawing more attention from inside the lobby. A man near the elevator slowed, turning his head. A woman at the front desk paused mid-sentence, her eyes lifting despite herself. The scene was no longer contained at the door, it had begun to seep inward. Malcolm let the silence follow the manager's words for a full second longer than expected. Then he spoke again, his voice still low, still steady, but now carrying something different, something that did not ask to be heard, but was heard anyway. "Time is exactly what I am not wasting," he said. The sentence hung in the air longer than it should have. The phrasing simple, but the meaning layered. The manager blinked once, his expression tightening, as if he could feel the shift without understanding it. The young woman inside pressed her lips together, her gaze moving from Malcolm to the manager, then back again, something in her expression changing from curiosity to recognition, not of who Malcolm was, but of what was happening. Malcolm lifted his phone slightly, not pointing it, not presenting it, just bringing it into view enough for the manager to notice. "You should keep going," Malcolm added, almost conversational, almost encouraging. "Say everything you need to say." The manager frowned, confusion mixing with irritation. "Excuse me," he said. Malcolm did not raise his voice, he did not step forward, he did not change his stance. "Every assumption, every instruction, every reason you believe I do not belong here," he continued calmly. "I want it all on record." The word record landed differently, this time heavier, more intentional. The first guard shifted his weight subtly, the second guard's posture tightened just slightly. The manager's eyes flicked to the phone, then back to Malcolm, suspicion beginning to edge into his certainty. "You are recording this?" he asked. Malcolm shook his head once, slow, deliberate. "No," he said. "I am documenting it." The distinction was quiet but precise, and it changed the air in a way no one could quite explain. The receptionist inside stopped typing completely, now her screen forgotten as she watched the exchange unfold. The man near the elevators took a step closer, pretending to adjust his jacket, while clearly listening. The boundaries of the moment had expanded beyond the doorway. Malcolm lowered his phone again, letting his arm rest naturally at his side. "So go ahead," he said softly, his gaze steady, unwavering. "Show me how this place works." The silence that followed his words did not feel empty. It felt loaded, like something had been set in motion that could not be easily undone. The manager shifted his stance again, this time slower, more deliberate, as if buying himself a second to regain control that had begun to slip. Without warning, his eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in calculation. "You think this is some kind of game?" He said, his voice lower now, less for the crowd and more for Malcolm, as if pulling the moment closer would shrink its impact. Malcolm did not answer. Right away, he let the question sit between them like an object neither of them needed to touch. The guards exchanged another glance, shorter this time, tighter, as if they both sensed the same shift, but could not name it. The young woman inside took one more step forward, now standing just inches from the glass, her reflection no longer overlapping with Malcolm's, but aligned with him, as if she had chosen a side. Without saying it out loud, the receptionist behind her stopped, pretending entirely her hands resting still on the keyboard, eyes fixed on the entrance. The building itself seemed to notice the tension, the hum of conversation lowering just enough to make the space feel different, more focused, more aware. Malcolm's phone buzzed again, a second vibration, quick and controlled. He glanced down, this time not hiding the motion. His thumb moved once, reading another update before locking the screen again. When he looked up, his gaze had not hardened, but it had sharpened, like something inside him had clicked into place. "You are still here," the manager said, the statement sounding less like authority and more like disbelief. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, the same subtle motion from before, the same calm presence that refused to match the energy being pushed toward him. "So are you," he replied quietly. The words were simple, but they shifted the balance again, not aggressive, not defensive, just undeniable. The manager let out a breath through his nose, his jaw tightening. "Last chance," he said, louder now, the volume returning, as if reclaiming it would restore control. "Either step aside, or we escalate this." The word escalate echoed differently than he intended. It carried weight, it carried consequence, it carried attention. The man with the coffee moved closer, now standing near the edge of the entrance, pretending to check his phone while clearly listening. A couple passing by slowed just enough to linger. The invisible circle around the moment widened. Malcolm did not move. He did not step forward. He did not step back. He simply stood exactly where he had been, as if the ground beneath him belonged to him in a way they did not understand. "Go ahead," Malcolm said softly, his voice steady, almost inviting. "Escalate it." The invitation caught the manager off guard, not because of the words, but because of the absence of fear behind them. The guards straightened slightly, their posture tightening, as if preparing for a next step they had expected to control, but now were unsure of the outcome. The manager reached for his radio, his hand pausing for a fraction of a second before pressing the button. "Front entrance, we need additional support," he said, his tone clipped, professional, the kind of voice used when trying to sound certain, even when certainty was fading. Malcolm watched the motion without reaction, his expression unchanged, his breathing, even his presence, unshaken. The young woman inside glanced toward the receptionist, then back to Malcolm, her lips parting slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but did not know how to begin. The receptionist shook her head, almost imperceptibly, a silent signal to stay out of it, to let the moment play out the way moments like this always did, except this one was not following the usual script. Malcolm's phone buzzed again, longer this time, a sustained vibration that he acknowledged with a brief glance. His thumb moved across the screen, slower, now more deliberate. Then he lifted his eyes back to the manager. "You might want to stop," Malcolm said calmly, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. The manager laughed once, short, sharp. "Stop what exactly?" he asked, the question edged with irritation. Malcolm did not answer directly. Instead, he shifted his gaze past the manager into the lobby, toward the front desk monitors visible from the entrance. The receptionist followed his line of sight, instinctively, her eyes flicking to her screen and then widening slightly before she quickly looked back at Malcolm, confusion crossing her face. "What are you doing?" The manager pressed, stepping closer again, as if proximity would force clarity. Malcolm's lips moved just enough to form the next words, each one measured, each one placed exactly where it needed to land. "Watching." He said the word simple, but heavy. The receptionist's fingers hovered over her keyboard, then pulled back completely, As the screen in front of her flickered once subtle enough that only someone looking directly at it would notice, her breath caught just slightly. The young woman beside her leaned in, her eyes scanning the display, confusion turning into concern. "Sir," the receptionist said hesitantly, her voice cutting into the tension for the first time, "there is something happening in the system." The manager turned his head sharply toward her, irritation flashing across his face. "Not now," he snapped, the dismissal automatic, reflexive. Malcolm did not move, he did not smile, he did not react outwardly. But something in the air shifted again, this time deeper, more undeniable. The guards looked toward the receptionist, then back to Malcolm, uncertainty beginning to replace their earlier confidence. The man with the coffee lowered his phone completely, now no longer pretending to be uninvolved. The couple outside stopped walking altogether, their attention fixed on the entrance. Malcolm lifted his phone slightly again, not to show, not to prove, just to acknowledge its presence as part of what was unfolding. "You wanted to escalate," Malcolm said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to reach everyone close enough to hear. "Now it is escalating." Manager's expression tightened, his eyes flicking between Malcolm and the receptionist, then back again, trying to piece together something that no longer fit his expectations. "What did you do?" he demanded. Malcolm met his gaze fully now, his calm, unwavering, his presence anchored in a way that made everything around him feel less stable. "I gave you exactly what you asked for," Malcolm replied, the words landing like a quiet verdict, not loud, not dramatic, but final in a way that could not be undone. And somewhere inside the building, unseen but undeniable, something had already begun to change. The words did not echo, but their impact traveled inward like a ripple moving through still water, the kind that looks small at the surface but shifts everything beneath it. The manager did not respond right away, his expression tightening, not from anger, but from something far less comfortable, uncertainty. The receptionist turned fully toward her screen, now her fingers hovering just above the keyboard as if afraid that touching anything might make it worse. "Sir, it is not just a flicker," she said more firmly, this time her voice no longer hesitant, but controlled in a way that demanded attention. "Access logs are updating on their own." The young woman beside her leaned closer, her eyes scanning the monitor, her breath shallow as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The manager hesitated, then turned halfway toward the desk, irritation still clinging to his tone. "Then fix it," he said, dismissively, as if systems could be corrected with volume alone. Malcolm remained exactly where he was, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, like an anchor in a moment that was beginning to drift. The guard shifted again, this time not toward Malcolm, but slightly back, as if instinct was telling them to create distance. Without understanding why, the man with the coffee took another step closer, now standing just inside the outer edge of the entrance, his eyes moving between Malcolm and the front desk. The couple outside no longer pretended to walk past. They had stopped, completely drawn into the moment without permission. "Sir, it is not something I can fix," the receptionist said, her voice tightening, now edged with concern. "Profiles are being flagged and permissions are changing." The manager turned fully, this time his attention pulled away from Malcolm for the first time since the confrontation began. "What do you mean flagged?" he asked, his tone sharper now, but directed inward toward the building rather than outward toward Malcolm. The receptionist swallowed, once her eyes flicking briefly toward Malcolm before returning to the screen. "Manager-level access is being reviewed in real time," she said carefully, each word chosen as if speaking too quickly might make it more real. The manager blinked, confusion breaking through his control. "Reviewed by who?" he asked, the question immediate, almost defensive. Malcolm finally moved, not forward, not backward, but just enough to shift his weight, a subtle change that drew attention. Without demanding it, his gaze remained steady, his voice calm. When he spoke, "By the system you rely on," he said, the words quiet but precise. The manager turned back toward him slowly, his expression no longer confident, but searching. "That is not possible," he said quickly, the denial automatic. Malcolm tilted his head slightly again, the same measured motion from before. "It is already happening," he replied, the simplicity of the statement making it harder to reject. Inside the building, a soft tone sounded from the front desk, not loud, not alarming, but distinct enough to draw every eye in the room toward the monitors. The receptionist's screen changed again, this time more visibly, lines of information shifting, columns updating, names appearing and disappearing in ways that did not follow any normal process. The young woman beside her took a small step back, her hand rising slightly toward her mouth, not in fear, but in disbelief. "Sir, your access badge just changed status." The receptionist set her voice steady, but unmistakably different now. The manager frowned, reaching instinctively toward his chest, where his badge rested. He glanced down at it, then back up, as if expecting the physical object to confirm something the system no longer supported. "What status?" He asked the question slower, now more cautious. The receptionist hesitated for half a second, then answered, "Pending review." The words landed heavier than any raised voice could have. The guards exchanged another glance, this time longer, this time filled with something closer to concern. The second guard shifted his stance again, stepping slightly away from the manager. Without fully committing to the movement, Malcolm watched everything without interruption, without reaction, his presence unchanged, but his silence now louder than anything else in the space. The man with the coffee lowered his arm completely, his cup forgotten in his hand. As he leaned slightly forward, the couple outside stepped closer to the glass, their reflection merging with the scene inside, creating a layered image of observers and participants. Malcolm's phone buzzed again, a longer vibration this time. He looked down briefly, reading, then lifted his eyes back to the manager. "You should stop asking what is happening," Malcolm said calmly, "and start asking why." The manager's jaw tightened, his gaze flicking once more toward the front desk, then back to Malcolm. "What did you do?" he repeated, but this time the question carried less accusation and more urgency. Malcolm did not rush his answer. He let the moment hold its shape, let the tension stretch just enough to make every word that followed land exactly where it needed to. "I did not do anything," Malcolm said quietly. "I let everything continue exactly as it was." The phrasing confused the manager more than any explanation would have, his eyes narrowing as he tried to process the statement. The receptionist spoke again, this time more quickly as the system continued to change. "There are alerts coming in from corporate-level oversight," she said, her voice now unmistakably tense. "Audit protocol is active." The word audit moved through the room like a shift in gravity. The guards straightened instinctively. The young woman's eyes widened. The man with the coffee exhaled slowly, as if realizing the moment had become something far bigger than a simple confrontation. The manager's expression changed again. The confidence that had carried him at the beginning of the exchange now fractured by something deeper, something systemic, that does not activate without authorization. He said almost to himself. Malcolm met his gaze fully, his voice still low, still controlled, but now carrying a clarity that cut through everything else. "It does when someone finally decides to pay attention," he said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of realization, full of the understanding that the moment had crossed a line none of them could step back over. The receptionist's screen updated again, this time locking certain fields, highlighting others in red. The manager's badge indicator shifted once more from pending review to restricted. The change was small visually, but massive in meaning. The guards noticed it, the receptionist noticed it, the young woman noticed it. And most importantly, the manager noticed it. His hand hovered near his badge again, but did not touch it this time, as if afraid that acknowledging it physically would make it irreversible. Malcolm remained still, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, but his presence now undeniable, not because he had raised his voice, not because he had revealed anything yet, but because everything around him had begun to move in response to him. "You told me to wait outside," Malcolm said softly, his words measured, deliberate, each one landing with quiet precision. "So I did." He paused just long enough for the statement to settle, for the meaning to form, for the weight of the moment to fully arrive. Then he added, without raising his voice, without changing his tone, "And now everything inside is finally catching up to that decision." The shift did not stop at the front desk. It spread deeper into the building like a quiet signal, moving through wires unseen, but undeniable. Screens inside offices began to update. Access panels blinked once, twice, then settled into new permissions. Doors that had always responded instantly hesitated for a fraction of a second before unlocking, as if the system itself was pausing to reconsider who belonged and who did not. The manager felt it before he understood it, his confidence no longer anchored in certainty, but drifting in something unfamiliar, something unstable. His eyes moved again to the receptionist, this time not with authority, but with expectation. "Tell me exactly what is changing," he said, his voice lower, now controlled in a different way, not commanding, but searching. The receptionist swallowed, her fingers finally touching the keyboard again, not to fix, but to read. "User profiles are being cross-checked against executive-level verification," she said carefully, her eyes scanning the screen as lines continued to update in real time. There is a priority override attached to an unidentified presence at the entrance. The word unidentified landed. Strangely in the air, the guards both turned their heads slightly toward Malcolm at the same time, as if the system had just pointed to him. Without saying his name, Malcolm did not react. He did not acknowledge the shift outwardly, but his stillness now carried something heavier, something that filled the space around him rather than simply occupying it. The young woman inside stepped even closer, now standing almost flush with the glass, her reflection no longer separate but layered into the moment, her voice barely above a whisper. That means someone with clearance is not recognized by the system's initial scan. She said more to herself than anyone else, but loud enough to be heard. The manager's jaw tightened again, his mind moving quickly, trying to reassemble control from fragments that no longer aligned. There is no one here with that level of clearance, he said, but the statement sounded less like certainty and more like a hope. Malcolm shifted his gaze slightly toward the front desk, not turning his body, just adjusting his focus, as if aligning himself with the center of what was unfolding. His phone buzzed again, another controlled vibration. He glanced down briefly, then locked the screen. Without hesitation, when he looked up, his eyes moved past the manager, this time toward the interior of the building, as if tracking something no one else could see. There is now, Malcolm said quietly, the word simple but placed with precision. The manager's breath caught just slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough to change the rhythm of the moment. The receptionist's screen flickered again, this time more dramatically. A new window opened, overlaying the existing system interface. Her eyes widened as she leaned closer, reading rapidly. There is a direct link to corporate oversight active, she said, her voice tightening with urgency. It is not just an audit, it is a live review. The phrase live review carried weight. It meant someone somewhere was watching in real time, not later, not through reports. But now the guards shifted again, this time not just in posture, but in presence, their earlier firmness replaced by something more cautious, more aware. The man with the coffee took another small step forward, now fully within the edge of the entrance, his attention locked on the unfolding scene. The couple outside pressed closer to the glass, their reflection merging with the interior, creating a layered image of observers drawn into something they could not fully understand. Malcolm remained exactly where he was, his presence unchanged, but the space around him now moved differently, as if the building itself was adjusting to him rather than the other way around. Sir, there is a name attempting to resolve against the system, the receptionist said, her voice now steady but charged with tension. It is not displaying fully, but it is triggering executive-level flags. The manager turned sharply toward her, his frustration now edged with urgency. What name? He asked. Malcolm did not speak. He did not need to. The moment stretched just long enough for anticipation to build, for the silence to become part of the story. The receptionist hesitated, her eyes scanning the screen again, as if waiting for the system to confirm what she was seeing. It is incomplete, she said slowly, but the identifier is linked to ownership records. The word ownership did not echo. It settled heavy and immediate. The manager's expression shifted again, this time unmistakably, his certainty breaking apart into something far less stable. That is not possible, he said again, but the repetition no longer carried conviction. Malcolm finally moved his hand, lifting the phone slightly, not to display it, not to prove anything, but to acknowledge its role in what was unfolding. His thumb tapped once on the screen. Deliberate controlled. The receptionist's monitor updated instantly. The partial identifier expanded, resolving letter by letter. The young woman beside her leaned in, her eyes widening as recognition began to form. Sir, the receptionist said, her voice now unmistakably tense. The system is identifying the presence at the entrance as a primary stakeholder. The phrase landed harder than any accusation could have. The guards looked at each other again, this time openly, their uncertainty no longer hidden. The manager stood still, his posture rigid, as if refusing to move might stop the moment from advancing. Malcolm's voice, when it came, was still calm, still measured, but now carried something else, something final. You asked who I was here to see, he said quietly, his gaze steady on the manager. I told you, the person responsible. He paused just long enough for the connection to begin forming, for the realization to start taking shape. Then he added without raising his voice, you just have not been looking in the right direction. The receptionist's screen completed the identification, the name resolved fully, now visible, undeniable. The young woman's breath caught audibly as she read it, her eyes snapping toward Malcolm with a clarity that had not been there before. The manager did not move. He did not speak, his gaze fixed on Malcolm, as if trying to reconcile the image in front of him with the information. Now staring back from the system, Malcolm remained still, his presence unwavering, his expression unchanged, but everything around him had shifted. The building, the system, the people, the assumptions, all of it now moving in response to something they could no longer ignore. And in that moment, without a raised voice, without a dramatic gesture, without anything except truth placed at exactly the right time, the line between who belonged and who decided that had already begun to collapse. The shift did not stop at the front desk. It spread deeper into the building like a quiet signal moving through wires unseen, but undeniable. Screens inside offices began to update, access panels blinked once, twice, then settled into new permissions. Doors that had always responded instantly hesitated for a fraction of a second before unlocking, as if the system itself was pausing to reconsider who belonged and who did not. The manager felt it before he understood it, his confidence no longer anchored in certainty but drifting in something unfamiliar, something unstable. His eyes moved again to the receptionist, this time not with authority, but with expectation. "Tell me exactly what is changing," he said, his voice lower, now controlled in a different way, not commanding, but searching. The receptionist swallowed, her fingers finally touching the keyboard again, not to fix, but to read. "User profiles are being cross-checked against executive-level verification," she said carefully, her eyes scanning the screen as lines continued to update in real time. "There is a priority override attached to an unidentified presence at the entrance." The word unidentified landed strangely in the air. The guards both turned their heads slightly toward Malcolm at the same time, as if the system had just pointed to him. Without saying his name, Malcolm did not react. He did not acknowledge the shift outwardly, but his stillness now carried something heavier, something that filled the space around him rather than simply occupying it. The young woman inside stepped even closer, now standing almost flush with the glass, her reflection no longer separate, but layered into the moment, her voice barely above a whisper. "That means someone with clearance is not recognized by the system's initial scan," she said, more to herself than anyone else, but loud enough to be heard. The manager's jaw tightened again, his mind moving quickly, trying to reassemble control from fragments that no longer aligned. "There is no one here with that level of clearance," he said, but the statement sounded less like certainty and more like a hope. Malcolm shifted his gaze slightly toward the front desk, not turning his body, just adjusting his focus, as if aligning himself with the center of what was unfolding. His phone buzzed again, another controlled vibration. He glanced down briefly, then locked the screen without hesitation. When he looked up, his eyes moved past the manager, this time toward the interior of the building, as if tracking something no one else could see. "There is now," Malcolm said quietly, the words simple, but placed with precision. The manager's breath caught, just slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough to change the rhythm of the moment. The receptionist's screen flickered again, this time more dramatically. A new window opened, overlaying the existing system interface. Her eyes widened as she leaned closer, reading rapidly. "There is a direct link to corporate oversight. Active," she said, her voice tightening with urgency. "It is not just an audit, it is a live review." The phrase live review carried weight. It meant someone somewhere was watching in real time, not later, not through reports. But now the guards shifted again, this time not just in posture, but in presence, their earlier firmness replaced by something more cautious, more aware. The man with the coffee took another small step forward, now fully within the edge of the entrance, his attention locked on the unfolding scene. The couple outside pressed closer to the glass, their reflection merging with the interior, creating a layered image of observers drawn into something they could not fully understand. Malcolm remained exactly where he was, his presence unchanged, but the space around him now moved differently, as if the building itself was adjusting to him rather than the other way around. "Sir, there is a name attempting to resolve against the system," the receptionist said, her voice now steady but charged with tension. "It is not displaying fully, but it is triggering executive-level flags." The manager turned sharply toward her, his frustration now edged with urgency. "What name?" he asked. Malcolm did not speak. He did not need to. The moment stretched just long enough for anticipation to build, for the silence to become part of the story. The receptionist hesitated, her eyes scanning the screen again, as if waiting for the system to confirm what she was seeing. "It is incomplete," she said slowly, But the identifier is linked to ownership records. The word ownership did not echo. It settled heavy and immediate. The manager's expression shifted again, this time unmistakably, his certainty breaking apart into something far less stable. That is not possible, he said again, but the repetition no longer carried conviction. Malcolm finally moved his hand, lifting the phone slightly, not to display it, not to prove anything, but to acknowledge its role in what was unfolding. His thumb tapped once on the screen. Deliberate, controlled. The receptionist's monitor updated instantly. The partial identifier expanded, resolving letter by letter. The young woman beside her leaned in, her eyes widening as recognition began to form. Sir, the receptionist said, her voice now unmistakably tense. The system is identifying the presence at the entrance as a primary stakeholder. The phrase landed harder than any accusation could have. The guards looked at each other again, this time openly, their uncertainty no longer hidden. The manager stood still, his posture rigid, as if refusing to move might stop the moment from advancing. Malcolm's voice, when it came, was still calm, still measured, but now carried something else, something final. You asked who I was here to see, he said quietly, his gaze steady on the manager. I told you the person responsible. He paused just long enough for the connection to begin forming, for the realization to start taking shape. Then he added without raising his voice, you just have not been looking in the right direction. The receptionist's screen completed the identification, the name resolved fully, now visible, undeniable. The young woman's breath caught audibly as she read it, her eyes snapping toward Malcolm with a clarity that had not been there before. The manager did not move. He did not speak, his gaze fixed on Malcolm, as if trying to reconcile the image in front of him with the information now staring back from the system. Malcolm remained still, his presence unwavering, his expression unchanged, but everything around him had shifted. The building, the system, the people, the assumptions, all of it now moving in response to something they could no longer ignore. And in that moment, without a raised voice, without a dramatic gesture, without anything except truth placed at exactly the right time, the line between who belonged and who decided that had already begun to collapse. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the air inside did not welcome him. It recalibrated. Conversations did not stop instantly, but they slowed just enough to acknowledge a shift that could not be ignored. Malcolm Hayes did not look around like someone entering unfamiliar space. He moved with the quiet certainty of someone who already knew every corner, every system, every decision that had ever been made within these walls. His pace was measured, unhurried, each step deliberate against the polished floor that reflected him clearly, now no longer fragmented by glass or distance. The guards who had blocked him seconds ago remained near the entrance, but their posture had changed completely, no longer forming a barrier, but standing aside, as if instinctively recognizing a boundary. They no longer had the authority to enforce. The manager did not follow immediately. He stood where he was for a brief second longer, caught between two realities, the one he had just enforced and the one now unfolding in front of him. When he finally stepped forward, it was not with the same confidence. His stride had lost its edge, his shoulders no longer carried the same certainty. Malcolm did not stop at the front desk. He did not address the receptionist first. He walked past her, just enough to position himself within the center of the lobby, a place where the space opened wider, where visibility increased, where presence could not be minimized. The receptionist turned in her chair, following him with her eyes, her earlier hesitation replaced with attention. The young woman beside her stepped slightly forward, her gaze fixed on Malcolm, as if watching something unfold that she would remember long after this moment ended. The man with the coffee moved inside, now standing near one of the pillars, his curiosity no longer hidden. Other individuals in the lobby adjusted their positions subtly. Conversations paused mid-sentence, eyes lifted, phones lowered. Everything in the room seemed to orient itself toward Malcolm without him asking for it. He stopped walking, not abruptly, not dramatically, but at a point that felt intentional, as if he had already decided where this moment would take place before anyone else understood what it was becoming. He turned slowly, facing the manager now, who had followed him in and was standing a few feet away, the distance between them no longer defined by authority, but by consequence. Malcolm's expression remained calm, unchanged. His voice, when he spoke, carried the same steady tone it had from the beginning, but now it filled the space in a way it had not before. You created a standard at that door, he said quietly, the words not raised but heard clearly by everyone within range. You decided who belongs and who waits. The manager swallowed, his gaze shifting briefly toward the front desk, then back to Malcolm as if searching for something to hold on to. "I did not know who you were." He repeated the sentence, sounding smaller this time, less like a defense, and more like an admission. Malcolm took a single step closer, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to close the distance slightly. "Exactly." He said the word simple, but final. The receptionist's screen behind them updated again, another alert, another confirmation, another layer of oversight settling into place. She did not interrupt this time. She did not speak. She simply watched the system reflect what was already happening in the room. The young woman beside her nodded once slowly, her eyes never leaving Malcolm. The guards remained still near the entrance, their attention fixed not on enforcing anything, but on understanding what they had just been. Part of the man with the coffee shifted his weight, slightly leaning against the pillar, his expression thoughtful now rather than curious. Malcolm continued, his voice steady, measured, each word placed with intention. "You were certain enough to act without asking," he said, his gaze steady on the manager. "Certain enough to define my place before you understood it." The manager's shoulders dropped slightly, his posture no longer rigid, his hands no longer positioned for control, but hanging at his sides, uncertain what to do with them. Malcolm did not raise his voice. He did not escalate. He did not need to. The weight of what had already happened filled the space more effectively than volume ever could. "And now," Malcolm added softly, "the system you trust is asking questions you did not think to ask." The receptionist's screen flickered again, as if responding to his words. Another notification appeared, this time larger, more prominent. She inhaled slowly, then spoke, her voice clear and steady. "Corporate oversight has escalated this to executive review." The phrase carried through the lobby like a quiet signal. Several people shifted their stance again, attention sharpening. The manager's eyes moved to her, then back to Malcolm, his expression now fully changed, not defensive, not dismissive, but aware. Malcolm held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned slightly, addressing the room, not directly, but in a way that included everyone present. "This is not about me walking through a door," he said calmly. "It is about how quickly a decision becomes a policy when no one questions it." The words settled into the space, deeper than anything that had been said before. The young woman's eyes widened slightly, as if the statement had reached beyond the moment, into something broader, something familiar. The man with the coffee nodded once under his breath. The guards looked at each other again, not uncertain now, but reflective. Malcolm turned back to the manager, his voice lowering slightly, but losing none of its clarity. "You did not need to know who I was to treat me correctly," he said, the sentence simple, direct, impossible to misunderstand. The manager opened his mouth, then closed it again, no response forming, because none would change what had already been revealed. Malcolm let the silence follow, not to pressure, not to dominate, but to allow the truth to settle fully. Then he added one final line, his tone unchanged, his presence steady. "And that is why this matters." The receptionist's screen updated once more, the system continuing its quiet transformation behind them, but the real shift had already happened in the room, in the space between people, in the understanding that had replaced assumption. Malcolm stood there not as someone who had just proven something, but as someone who had simply allowed the truth to be seen, and in that moment every person present understood that what had happened at the door was no longer just an interaction, it was a reflection of something larger, something now impossible to ignore. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling over the lobby like a weight no one could step around. Malcolm Hayes did not move after his last words. He did not need to. The room itself had begun to respond in ways that made movement unnecessary. The manager stood in front of him, no longer positioned as a gatekeeper, but as someone caught in the consequences of a decision he could not take back. His eyes shifted once more toward the front desk, then back again. But this time, there was no attempt to regain control, only an effort to understand how quickly it had been lost. The receptionist's screen continued to update, lines of information stacking one after another, access reviews, compliance alerts, internal flags, all moving with a precision that felt deliberate rather than reactive. She inhaled slowly, her voice steady, but quieter now, as if the system itself demanded respect. Executive oversight has initiated a behavioral audit across all front-facing personnel. She said, the phrasing formal, but the meaning unmistakable. The young woman beside her pressed her lips together, her gaze fixed on Malcolm, then on the manager, as if witnessing the exact moment where assumption had turned into accountability. The guards remained near the entrance, but their attention had shifted completely, no longer watching Malcolm as a subject of concern, but As the center of a situation, they now realized they had misread. One of them adjusted his stance, subtly stepping even further back, creating more space than before, not out of instruction, but out of instinct. The man with the coffee leaned slightly against the pillar, now his earlier curiosity replaced with a quiet recognition that what he was seeing was not just an isolated moment, but something that echoed beyond this room. Malcolm's phone buzzed again. He glanced down briefly, his thumb moving once across the screen before locking it again. When he looked up, his expression remained unchanged, calm, controlled, unshaken, but there was a clarity in his gaze now that made everything around him feel sharper, more defined. The manager finally spoke, his voice lower than before, stripped of the confidence it had carried at the beginning. "What happens now?" he asked, the question simple but heavy. Malcolm did not answer immediately. He let the question exist. He let the room hold it for a moment longer, as if allowing everyone present to feel the weight of what had already been set in motion. Then he took a slow breath, not out of tension, but out of intention, and when he spoke, his voice remained steady, measured, but now carried something deeper, something that reached beyond the immediate moment. "Now," Malcolm said quietly, "you see what has always been there." The words did not offer resolution, they offered perspective. The receptionist's screen flickered again, another update, another confirmation. She leaned slightly forward, her eyes scanning quickly before speaking again. "Individual action logs are being reviewed against company standards in real time," she said, her tone precise, controlled. "Every decision is being matched to policy and recorded behavior." The manager's shoulders lowered slightly, his posture no longer resisting, but absorbing the reality of the situation. The young woman beside the receptionist nodded once slowly, her expression shifting from uncertainty to understanding. The guards exchanged another glance, this time not uncertain, not hesitant, but reflective, as if recognizing their role within a larger pattern. Malcolm shifted his gaze briefly across the room, not scanning, not searching, but acknowledging the presence of everyone who had become part of the moment. The individuals near the elevators, the receptionist, the young woman, the guards, the man with the coffee, all of them now connected by something that had started at the door and moved inward without permission. "This is not about one decision," Malcolm continued, his voice calm, but carrying clearly across the space. "It is about the pattern behind it." The words settled deeper than anything before. The young woman's eyes widened slightly, as if something had clicked into place. The man with the coffee nodded again, more visibly this time. The guards remained still, but their posture reflected a quiet awareness. Malcolm returned his gaze to the manager, his expression unchanged, but his presence now undeniable in a way that required no explanation. "You did what felt normal," he said, "and that is exactly why it matters." The manager's jaw tightened slightly, not in defiance, but in realization. His eyes dropped for a brief second before lifting again to meet Malcolm's gaze, but this time there was no challenge in it, only acknowledgement. The receptionist's screen updated again, this time highlighting specific entries. Her voice followed almost immediately. "There are prior incidents flagged under similar circumstances," she said carefully. "Unverified individuals denied access without escalation." The phrase "unverified individuals" echoed in the room, carrying a weight that extended beyond its technical meaning. Malcolm did not react outwardly, but the pause that followed allowed the implication to settle fully. The young woman's hand tightened slightly around the edge of the desk, her expression shifting as the pattern became clearer. The guards remained silent, their earlier certainty now replaced by something closer to reflection. The manager exhaled slowly, the sound quiet but noticeable in the stillness. "I thought I was following procedure," he said, the words not defensive, not dismissive, just honest. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, the same measured motion as before, his voice calm. When he responded, "Procedure is not the problem," he said, "it is how you choose to apply it." The distinction landed with precision. The receptionist glanced briefly at Malcolm, then back to her screen, as if the system itself was echoing his words. The young woman nodded again, this time more firmly. The guards shifted slightly, but did not move forward. The man with the coffee straightened from the pillar, his posture more attentive. Malcolm allowed another moment of silence, not to extend tension, but to let clarity settle fully. Then he added one final line, his tone steady, his presence unwavering. "Because policy should never replace judgment." The words lingered in the air longer than anything else that had Instead, the room did not respond immediately. It absorbed the statement, each person processing it in their own way. The receptionist's screen continued to update the system, still moving, still recording, still reviewing. But the most important shift had already taken place, not in the technology, not in the alerts, but in the awareness that had spread through the room. Malcolm stood there not as someone demanding control, not as someone asserting power, but as someone revealing truth. And in that moment, every person present understood that what had started as a simple instruction at a doorway had become something far more significant, something that could not be undone and would not be forgotten. The room did not return to normal. It settled into something else, something quieter, but heavier, as if every person inside had become aware of a layer that had always existed but had never been acknowledged. Malcolm Hayes remained still at the center of the lobby, not commanding attention, yet holding it. Completely, the manager stood a few feet away, his posture no longer defensive, no longer assertive, but uncertain in a way that made his earlier certainty feel distant, almost unrecognizable. The receptionist's screen continued to update, each new line of data reinforcing what had already been revealed. Her eyes moved quickly, but her movements had slowed, as if she understood that speed was no longer the priority. Clarity was. The audit is expanding to prior incident records. She said, her voice steady, but quieter now, as if speaking too loudly would disrupt the precision of what was unfolding. The young woman beside her leaned in again, her brow furrowing slightly as she read along, her lips moving faintly, as if repeating the information to herself to make sense of it. There are multiple entries flagged under discretionary denial. She added softly, the phrase hung in the air longer than expected. Discretionary denial. It sounded technical, but it carried something deeper, something that did not need explanation. Malcolm did not interrupt, he did not react outwardly, but his gaze shifted slightly toward the front desk, acknowledging the words without engaging them directly. The manager's eyes moved from the receptionist back to Malcolm, then down to the floor for a brief second before lifting again. I made a judgment based on what I saw. He said the sentence quiet, almost reflective. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, the same measured motion that had defined his presence from the beginning. His voice, when he responded, remained calm, but carried a sharper clarity now. You made a judgment based on what you assumed. He said, the distinction precise. The manager inhaled slowly, his shoulders rising then falling as the weight of that difference settled in. The guards remained near the entrance, but their focus had shifted inward. One of them crossed his arms loosely, not in defense, but in thought. The other adjusted his stance again, creating even more distance from where the initial confrontation had taken place, as if instinctively separating himself from a moment he now understood differently. The man with the coffee had moved closer, still now standing near the edge of the open space, his expression no longer curious, but contemplative, as if what he was witnessing had begun to connect to something beyond this building. Malcolm's phone buzzed again. He glanced down briefly, his thumb moving once across the screen before returning his attention to the room. When he looked up, his gaze passed over the manager and moved briefly across the others present, not scanning, not assessing, but recognizing the shared awareness that had formed. It is easy to believe a moment stands alone, Malcolm said quietly, his voice carrying without effort that it begins and ends at a door, at a desk, at a decision. The words settled into the space, drawing attention without demanding it. The young woman's eyes lifted from the screen, fully now focused on Malcolm. The receptionist paused, her hands resting lightly on the desk. As she listened, the guards remained still, their attention fixed. But moments like this do not exist on their own. Malcolm continued, they are built on patterns repeated so often they stop being questioned. The manager's jaw tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in recognition, his gaze dropping again for a brief second before lifting once more. The receptionist's screen updated again, highlighting older entries, timestamps, records of prior interactions, each one small on its own, but together forming something larger. Her voice followed almost immediately. There are at least 7 similar instances logged in the past 3 months, she said carefully, all categorized as non-escalated access denial. The number did not need emphasis, it carried its own weight. The young woman exhaled slowly, her hand resting against the edge of the desk as if grounding herself in the reality of what she was seeing. The guards exchanged another glance, this time longer, more deliberate. The man with the coffee shook his head slightly under his breath, not in disbelief, but in recognition. Malcolm allowed a brief silence after the receptionist spoke, not to build tension, but to allow the information to settle fully. Then he shifted his gaze back To the manager, his expression unchanged, but his presence more defined than ever. "You said you were following procedure," Malcolm said calmly. "But procedure does not write itself." The sentence landed with precision. The manager's lips parted slightly, but no response came immediately. The truth in the statement leaving little room for deflection. The receptionist glanced briefly at Malcolm, then back to her screen, as if the system itself was reflecting the same conclusion. The young woman nodded once more, this time more firmly, her understanding no longer forming but complete. Malcolm took a slow step forward, not closing the distance entirely, but enough to shift the dynamic of the space again. His voice remained steady, his tone unchanged, but the meaning behind his words carried further now. "Someone decides what normal looks like," he said, "and then everyone else repeats it." The manager's shoulders lowered slightly, his posture no longer attempting to hold anything in place. The guards remained silent, their earlier role now fully dissolved into observation. The man with the coffee straightened his stance, his attention fixed. Malcolm let another brief silence pass, then added one final line, his voice calm but unmistakably clear. "The question is not whether you followed the system," he said. "It is whether you ever stopped to see who the system was failing." The words lingered in the air longer than anything before them. The receptionist's screen continued to update, but now the movement of the system felt secondary to the shift that had already taken place in the room. The young woman looked from Malcolm to the manager, then back again, her expression steady. The guards remained still, their posture reflective. The man with the coffee nodded once slowly. Malcolm stood there, not raising his voice, not demanding anything, not asserting power in the way most expected, but revealing something far more difficult to ignore. And in that moment, every person present understood that what had begun as a simple instruction at the door had become a mirror, one that showed not just a single decision, but the pattern behind it. And once seen, it could not be unseen. The words did not fade, they stayed suspended in the space between everyone present like a truth that refused to move aside for comfort. Malcolm Hayes remained still after speaking, not because he had nothing left to say, but because what needed to be understood had already been placed in the room. The manager stood facing him, his posture no longer carrying the illusion of control, but something heavier, something more honest, the weight of recognition. The receptionist's screen continued to shift, but now each update felt less like new information and more like confirmation of what had already been revealed. Her eyes moved slower across the data, no longer scanning, but absorbing. The young woman beside her straightened slightly, her earlier uncertainty replaced with clarity, her gaze steady as she looked from the screen to Malcolm, then to the manager, as if aligning the facts with the moment unfolding in front of her. "The review has escalated to leadership notification." The receptionist said, her voice controlled but firm. "Senior executives have been alerted and are monitoring the situation in real time." The statement carried through the lobby with a quiet authority. Several individuals shifted their stance again, not out of discomfort, but out of awareness. The man with the coffee glanced toward the entrance, then back to Malcolm, as if measuring the distance between where this started and where it had now arrived. The guards remained still, their earlier roles dissolved into observation, their presence no longer shaping the moment, but witnessing it. The manager exhaled slowly, his breath controlled, but heavier than before, his eyes fixed on Malcolm, as if searching for something to say that would restore balance, but finding nothing that could undo what had already been set in motion. "I cannot change what happened," he said finally, his voice low, measured, stripped of defensiveness. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, the same deliberate motion, his expression calm, his presence steady. "No," he replied quietly, "you cannot." The agreement did not comfort, it clarified. The room remained silent for a brief moment, the kind of silence that did not ask for resolution, but for understanding. The receptionist's screen updated again, a new panel appearing with structured data outlining decisions, timestamps, outcomes. Her voice followed almost immediately. "Behavioral compliance scoring is being recalculated for all personnel involved," she said. "This interaction has been marked as a high-impact event." The phrase high-impact event settled into the room with a weight that did not need explanation. The young woman's hand tightened slightly against the edge of the desk, her eyes widening just a fraction as she processed the scale of what was happening. The Guards exchanged a glance again, this time not uncertain, not reflective, but resolved in a way that suggested they understood the significance of their presence within the moment. The man with the coffee straightened fully, now his earlier casual posture replaced. With focused attention, Malcolm shifted his gaze briefly across the room, acknowledging the presence of those who had become part of this moment. Without saying a word, then he returned his attention to the manager. His voice, when he spoke, carried the same calm tone, but now held something deeper, something that reached beyond the immediate situation. "This is not about consequences," he said quietly. "It is about clarity." The words did not accuse, they did not punish, they revealed. The manager's eyes dropped again for a brief second, then lifted once more, his expression no longer resisting, no longer uncertain, but accepting the truth of what had been exposed. The receptionist's screen flickered again, another update, another confirmation. The system continuing its process without pause. Her voice followed, steady, precise. "All access privileges for this management tier are now under temporary restriction, pending review." The statement was delivered without emphasis, but it landed with undeniable force. The manager's shoulders lowered slightly, his posture shifting not in defeat, but in recognition. The guards remained silent, their stance unchanged, but their understanding now clear. The young woman nodded once more, her gaze moving from the screen to Malcolm, then back again, as if witnessing a moment she knew would stay with her. Malcolm allowed a brief silence to follow, not to extend tension, but to let the meaning settle fully. Then he spoke again, his voice steady, measured, each word deliberate. "You believe this was a small decision," he said, "something routine, something insignificant." The manager's lips pressed together briefly, the truth in the statement leaving little room for denial. Malcolm took a slow step forward, not closing the space entirely, but enough to shift the dynamic once more, his presence filling the room without effort. "But every small decision builds something larger," he continued. "A pattern, a standard, a system." The words landed with quiet precision. The receptionist glanced at him briefly, then back to her screen, as if the system itself was echoing the same realization. The young woman's expression tightened slightly, her understanding deepening. The guards remained still, their earlier role now fully replaced by awareness. The man with the coffee nodded once under his breath. Malcolm paused for a brief moment, then added one final line, his voice calm, but carrying clearly across the room. "And today you saw what that system looks like when it is finally questioned." The silence that followed was not empty, it was full of understanding. The receptionist's screen continued to update, but the movement of data no longer defined the moment. The shift had already happened within the room, within the people. Within the space between assumption and awareness, Malcolm stood there not as someone who had taken control, but as someone who had revealed it. And in that moment, every person present understood that what had begun at the door had not ended inside the building. It had exposed something that extended far beyond both, and once seen, it could not be undone. The room did not shift back, it moved forward into something irreversible, something that no longer allowed anyone present to return to the version of events that existed before. Malcolm Hayes stood exactly where he had positioned himself, not elevated, not aggressive, but undeniably central. His presence no longer questioned, no longer interpreted, but understood. The manager remained in front of him, but the space between them had changed. It was no longer distance, it was consequence. The receptionist's screen continued its steady transformation, lines of data resolving into structured outcomes, flags turning into decisions. Her posture straightened slightly, as if the system itself demanded a different level of attention. Her voice followed, measured, clear. "Executive review has finalized preliminary actions," she said, the phrasing precise, but the meaning immediate. The young woman beside her leaned closer, her eyes scanning the updated panel, her breath slowing as clarity replaced uncertainty. "Specific roles are being evaluated for compliance failure tied to direct interaction," she added quietly. The guards remained still, but their attention sharpened, not outward, not defensive, but inward, reflective. The man with the coffee shifted his stance again, this time fully engaged, his earlier detachment replaced with focused awareness. The manager inhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on Malcolm, his expression no longer searching for control, but bracing for what came next. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice steady but quieter. Malcolm did not respond immediately. He allowed the question to exist within the room, to settle into the same space where everything else had unfolded. Then he looked briefly toward the front desk, acknowledging the system that had carried the moment this far before returning his gaze to the manager. His voice, when it came, was calm, measured, but now carried a finality that had not been spoken yet. It means the moment has been understood. He said the words simple but complete. The receptionist's screen updated again, this time locking certain entries, highlighting others in a clear, structured format. Her voice followed almost instantly. Management-level access is now officially suspended pending full review. She said, the statement delivered without emphasis, but landing with undeniable weight. The manager did not move immediately. His posture remained still as the words settled. His eyes dropped briefly, then lifted again, meeting Malcolm's gaze not with resistance, not with denial, but with recognition. The young woman's hand tightened slightly against the desk, her expression steady, her understanding complete. The guards exchanged another glance, this time not uncertain, not reflective, but resolved. The man with the coffee exhaled slowly, the sound quiet, but noticeable in the stillness. Malcolm remained calm, his expression unchanged, his presence steady, as if none of this required effort, because it did not. He had not forced anything, he had simply allowed it to be seen. This is not punishment, Malcolm said quietly, his voice carrying clearly across the room. This is alignment. The distinction mattered. It shifted the tone from reaction to correction. The manager nodded once slowly, the motion small but significant, his shoulders lowering, not in defeat, but in acceptance. The receptionist's screen updated again, a new layer appearing, one that outlined procedural next steps. Her voice followed steady, precise. Temporary reassignment protocols are being activated for all impacted roles, she said. Operational authority is being redirected to interim oversight. The phrase interim oversight carried with it a sense of structure, a sense that the system was not collapsing but recalibrating. The young woman nodded again, this time more firmly, her gaze moving between the screen and Malcolm, as if witnessing the completion of something that had begun long before this moment. The guards remained silent, their earlier presence now fully transformed into observation. The man with the coffee straightened, his posture fully, his attention unwavering. Malcolm shifted his gaze briefly across the room, acknowledging the presence of everyone who had become part of this moment, then returned his attention to the manager, his voice steady, his tone unchanged. You said you did not know, he said quietly. And you were right. The manager's expression tightened slightly, not in defense, but in understanding. Malcolm continued, his words measured, deliberate. But not knowing is not the same as not being responsible. The sentence landed with quiet precision. The manager exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering for a brief second before lifting again, this time steady, grounded. I understand that now, he said, the words simple but carrying weight. Malcolm nodded once, the motion small but intentional. The receptionist's screen flickered again, another confirmation, another finalization. Her voice followed. Full report documentation is being compiled and forwarded to executive leadership, she said. This interaction is now part of the official record. The phrase official record settled into the room like a closing statement. The young woman glanced briefly at Malcolm, then back to the screen, her expression calm, focused. The guards remained still, their posture unchanged. The man with the coffee nodded once more under his breath. Malcolm allowed a brief silence to follow, not to extend tension, but to let the moment complete itself. Then he spoke one final time, his voice calm, steady, unmistakably clear. This was never about a door, he said. It was about what that door represents. The words lingered in the air longer than anything before them. The receptionist's screen stopped updating the system, reaching a point of completion. The young woman straightened, her posture fully. The guards remained still. The man with the coffee did not move. The manager stood in place, his gaze steady, his understanding complete. Malcolm remained where he was, not moving, not asserting, not demanding, because nothing more was required. The moment had already done what it needed to do, and in that stillness, every person present understood that what had unfolded was not just an event, it was a correction, one that had revealed something deeper, something lasting, something that would remain long after the room returned to its usual rhythm. The room did not erupt, it did not fracture, it settled into something quieter, but far more permanent, the kind of stillness that follows not confusion, but understanding. Malcolm Hayes remained where he stood, his presence no longer a disruption, but a reference point, something. The entire space, now oriented around the manager, had not moved, his posture steady but no longer rigid, his shoulders no longer holding tension but carrying weight, the kind that comes from clarity rather than resistance. The receptionist's screen no longer flickered rapidly. The updates had slowed, structured, finalized, each line no longer forming, but confirming her hands rested lightly on the desk, no longer hovering, no longer reacting. The young woman beside her stood upright, her earlier hesitation completely gone, her gaze steady, focused, grounded in what she now understood. The guards near the entrance remained in place, but their stance had changed entirely, no longer positioned as enforcers, but as witnesses, their earlier certainty replaced with awareness. The man with the coffee had stopped shifting altogether, his posture, still, his attention fixed, as if recognizing that what he was seeing was not just an isolated moment, but something that would stay with him long after he walked out the door. Malcolm's phone vibrated once more, softer this time, almost subtle. He glanced down briefly, his thumb moving once before the screen dimmed again. When he looked up, nothing in his expression had changed, but something in the room had settled fully into place. The manager exhaled slowly, the breath controlled, but carrying a finality that had not been present before. "So this is it," he said quietly, not as a question, but as a realization. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, the same measured motion that had defined his presence from the beginning, his voice calm, steady. "This is the part where things become clear," he replied. The receptionist's screen displayed one final update, a structured notice, clean, direct, undeniable. Her voice followed, steady, precise. "Final determination has been issued for management review status," she said. "Immediate removal of operational authority is now in effect pending full reassignment." The words did not echo, they settled heavy and complete. The manager did not react outwardly. He did not step back. He did not speak. Immediately his gaze lowered briefly, then lifted again, meeting Malcolm's eyes with something different, something grounded, not in position, but in understanding. The young woman beside the receptionist nodded once, slowly, her expression calm, her posture steady. The guards remained still, but their presence now carried a quiet acknowledgement rather than authority. The man with the coffee exhaled again, softer this time, almost reflective. Malcolm allowed a brief silence to follow, not to extend tension, but to let the moment complete itself fully. Then he spoke again, his voice calm, measured, each word deliberate. "No one here needed to know my name," he said, "not to treat me with respect, not to follow the standard that was already supposed to exist." The statement landed deeper than anything before. It was not about revelation, it was about expectation. The manager's jaw tightened slightly, his gaze steady, not resisting, not deflecting, simply absorbing the truth of it. The receptionist's screen remained still now, the system no longer changing, no longer reacting, because it had reached its conclusion. The young woman's eyes moved briefly across the room, then back to Malcolm, as if taking in the full scope of what had unfolded. The guards remained silent, their earlier role fully dissolved into reflection. The man with the coffee nodded once under his breath. Malcolm shifted his gaze slightly, not away, not down, but outward, acknowledging the room, the people, the moment that had grown from something small into something undeniable. This building was never the question. He continued quietly. "It was never about whether I could walk through that door." The words settled with precision, the manager's shoulders lowered slightly, the final layer of resistance gone. The receptionist listened without moving, her attention fully on Malcolm. The young woman stood still, her understanding complete. Malcolm paused briefly, then added his next words with the same calm clarity. "The question was always how quickly someone decides who belongs without ever asking why." The sentence lingered longer than anything before. It did not accuse, it revealed. The manager closed his eyes for a brief second, then opened them again, his expression steady, grounded in something that had not been there earlier. "I see that now," he said simply. Malcolm nodded once, the motion small but intentional. The receptionist remained still, her screen unchanged. The young woman's posture relaxed slightly, but her focus did not shift. The guard stood quietly. The man with the coffee did not move. Malcolm allowed the silence to settle fully. Then he took a slow breath, not out of tension, but out of completion, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something final, not loud, not forceful, but absolute. Then this moment did what it was supposed to do. He said the words, simple but complete. The room did not respond with sound, it responded with stillness, the kind that holds meaning without needing to express it. The manager remained in place, the receptionist remained focused, the young woman remained steady, the guards remained aware, the man with the coffee remained present. Malcolm stood there, not as someone who had taken something, not as someone who had proven something, but as someone who had revealed something. And in that moment, every person in the room understood that what had happened was not just a correction of behavior, it was a correction of perspective, something that would not fade when the lobby returned to Its normal rhythm, something that would remain long after the moment itself had ended, because once seen clearly it could never be unseen again. The room did not return to what it had been before, because something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be reversed by routine or noise. Malcolm Hayes stood where he had been, not elevated, not distant, but grounded in a way that made everything else feel temporary. The manager remained across from him, no longer holding authority, but no longer collapsing under it either. Instead, he stood with a quiet understanding that had replaced every assumption he had carried. Just minutes ago, the receptionist remained at her desk, her screen now still, her hands resting calmly, no longer reacting, no longer chasing updates, because the system had finished saying what it needed to say. The young woman beside her stood with a posture that reflected clarity, not confusion, her gaze steady, her presence no longer uncertain, but aligned with what she had witnessed. The guards remained near the entrance, but their stance had fully transformed, not watchers, not enforcers, but witnesses to something that had redefined their role. Without a single command, the man with the coffee stood quietly near the pillar, no longer observing as an outsider, but present as someone who understood that what he had seen would not fade. When he stepped outside, Malcolm took a slow breath, not out of tension, but out of completion. His eyes moved briefly across the room, not scanning, not assessing, but acknowledging each person who had become part of this moment. Then he returned his gaze forward. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, steady, carrying a clarity that did not need volume. Moments like this are not rare, he said quietly. They are just rarely seen for what they are. The words settled into the space, not heavy, not forceful, but undeniable. The manager listened without interruption, his posture steady, his expression grounded in something that had replaced uncertainty with awareness. The receptionist remained still, her attention fully present. The young woman's eyes did not move from Malcolm. The guard stood quietly. The man with the coffee nodded once slowly. Malcolm continued, his voice measured, each word deliberate. Most of the time, they pass unnoticed, he said, because they look ordinary, they feel routine, they sound like policy. The phrasing did not accuse it. Revealed. The manager's gaze lowered briefly, then lifted again, his understanding deepening with each word. Malcolm paused for a moment, allowing the silence to carry the meaning before continuing. But what happened here was not about policy, he said. It was about perception. The distinction landed clearly. The young woman's breath steadied, her posture firm. The receptionist glanced briefly at the manager, then back to Malcolm. The guards remained still, their presence reflective. The man with the coffee shifted slightly, then stilled again. Malcolm took a small step, not forward, not away, but enough to change his position within the space, just slightly, his presence still central, but now less about confrontation and more about closure. You saw me and decided something before you knew anything, he said calmly, and that decision shaped everything that followed. The manager nodded once, the motion quiet, but significant, his earlier certainty now replaced with acceptance. Malcolm's voice did not change, but the weight behind it settled deeper. That is how systems are built. He continued, not in one moment, but in repeated ones. The words lingered in the air longer than any before them. The receptionist's screen remained still, the system no longer active, because the real shift had already occurred within the people in the room. The young woman's eyes softened slightly, her understanding complete. The guard stood with a quiet awareness. The man with the coffee exhaled slowly. Malcolm allowed another brief silence to pass, then spoke again, his tone unchanged, but final. Respect does not require recognition, he said. It requires consistency. The sentence settled into the space with a clarity that did not need explanation. The manager's shoulders lowered fully, now not in defeat, but in release, his posture steady, grounded in something new, something more honest. I will remember that, he said quietly. Malcolm nodded once, the motion small but intentional. The receptionist remained still, the young woman's gaze steady, the guards unmoving. The man with the coffee silent. Malcolm's eyes moved once more across the room, acknowledging the moment, the people, the shift that had taken place. Then he turned slightly toward the deeper part of the building, not rushed, not dramatic, just a natural continuation of where he was always meant to go. He did not look back. He did not need to. The space behind him had already changed in a way that did not require his presence to sustain it. As he began to walk, the room did not react with noise, it held its stillness, allowing the moment to settle fully into memory. The manager remained where he was, not frozen, but thoughtful. The receptionist looked down briefly at her screen, then back up, as if resetting her understanding of what her role now meant. The young woman straightened fully, her posture Reflecting a new clarity, the guards stood at the entrance, but their stance now carried awareness rather than assumption. The man with the coffee watched Malcolm move further inside, then slowly turned his gaze toward the door, as if measuring the distance between what had happened and what it meant. Malcolm continued forward, his steps steady, his presence unchanged as he disappeared into the building, not as someone entering a space, but as someone moving through what had always been his. And behind him, the lobby remained quiet, not because nothing had happened, but because everything had, and in that silence one truth remained clear to everyone who had witnessed it: dignity does not arrive with titles. It is revealed in moments like this, when everything else falls away, and what is left cannot be ignored.